Alright, so we're airborne again at Martins Bay, and we're just going to continue this look at the basic autopilot functions. So you remember last time we were looking at the flight director, and specifically about how the flight director relays useful cues to us for flying the aircraft manually. So we're just going to pick up where we left off there. I've still got that VOR, slope hill VOR dialed in. The visibility is a lot worse than it was when we were out here earlier on. Having set up the VOR, if I put the nav mode onto the autopilot, you'll see the flight director bar goes out to the right, and we need to put the aircraft into a right hand bank. Now I'm not going to do that because I just want to show you the next part of the picture. Now this is the fairly logical next step. This is an autopilot after all, we want it to fly the aircraft for us. So having set that up and having observed the cues the flight director is presenting to us on the ADI, all we have to do is move the autopilot master switch to engage, and the aircraft will then bank of its own accord, and you'll notice the flight director bars are now centered and the aircraft's in a roughly 20-degree bank as it moves to intercept that radial. Alright, so you should see if you look at the HSI that the autopilot's got us pretty much established on that radial. Interestingly, it's not exactly, we're not exactly steering the course that's set up, and that's probably because we've got a wind from the right. I've got the 80s for Queenstown set up on the COM1. Wind 249 at 3, so there's a slight discrepancy between the course that we've got programmed and the track over the ground. The other thing I wanted to demonstrate was we've got the Direct 2 set up to Queenstown on the GPS, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this. So the Direct 2 terminates at Queenstown Airfield, and the VOR is the blue blob to the left of that, so they're not coincident. If we go over to the GPS and press the CDI button, that switches the gain. If I just try and center that up, if you watch here, that changes that VLOC to GPS. So what that means is that the nav functions are now following the GPS, and you see the aircraft immediately banking to the right, because now what it's going to do is it's going to intercept that GPS Direct 2 course, which is more or less parallel to and offset from the course we were steering on the VOR. So currently it's flying an intercept heading to intercept that, and it's going to treat that just like it's a radial to a VOR, virtual VOR if you like. And so once we start to intercept that, if I zoom in a little bit, it should then steer us back onto track and then fly us along that to the airfield. And the airfield should be visible now. We're only about 7 miles away, 8 miles away. Should be over there. So just watching the GPS, and there it is, it's starting to turn us now onto track. So that's some of the basic nav functions. We're not going to look at those in detail, just to give you a quick survey of what we've got available. For the lateral modes, as we've seen, heading hold, which means we can control heading by the heading bug. In fact, what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to switch to heading hold now. So we're just now going to go straight ahead. I wanted you to know because we're almost overhead Queenstown. The thing will get confused if we leave it on GPS tracking. So we've got heading hold, we've got nav hold, which as we've seen can fly to a VOR, or it can fly according to the course set on the GPS. We've got approach mode, which can fly on an ILS, back course, which will essentially fly away from a VOR or an ILS. I think that's what that does. I'll think about that in a bit more detail, maybe in a future video. Then we've got the vertical mode, so altitude hold and airspeed hold. We've got some more modes which we're going to look at a little bit later. They work in conjunction with the altitude alerter. But for now, there's one thing that I've left out. You might be wondering what happens, or in fact you might have noticed what happens if you're flying a lateral mode, such as we are now, heading hold, we're going straight up that valley. So let me just finesse that slightly. So we're flying straight ahead up that valley on heading hold. You might have wondered, or you might have noticed, what happens if you pitch the aircraft. So if I pitch it down, what's interesting, you'll start to see you've got auto trim happening there. If I try and pitch it up, if I try and set the pitch up, in fact let's try a different experiment. I'm winding the trim wheel back now. I'm just keeping going, winding the trim wheel back. Basically nothing's happening. The trim stays neutral. What's actually happening is, when we're flying a lateral mode, the autopilot's holding the pitch that was set when we turned the master switch on. And in fact, if we turn the lateral mode off and we try and bank the aircraft, again we're going to find that the autopilot resists that and tries to restore it to the bank attitude that was in operation when we engaged the autopilot switch. And if I disengage the autopilot, and I'll just do it with bank first, if I try and keep it level, but put it in about a 20-degree bank and then engage the autopilot and then let go, you should see the autopilot's going to hold that bank in place. And indeed, if I do that again, and if I put it in a bank and a pitch attitude and switch the autopilot on, hands off, it's going to hold that bank and that pitch. I'm not going to allow it to do that because we might overspeed. But essentially that if no other modes are selected on the autopilot and we engage the master switch, that's an attitude hold function in operation. It's also called manual mode. The other thing I want to show you is, if you look at the top of the yoke pedestal in this aircraft, you're going to see a thing called the pitch and turn panel. And this is basically two nudge switches that allow us to play with that pitch and bank that's set up in the attitude hold mode, or the manual mode of the autopilot. So if I now, on my control setup, I don't have these controls replicated precisely. I've got push buttons, if you see this little panel here, but the functions are the same. And so if I press repeatedly the right hand bank button, or if I press and hold it, in fact, what you should see is that flight director bar moves out to the right, and then the autopilot is basically going to adjust the bank attitude to centre that lateral bar. And so you can see it's almost given us a wings level attitude. But in fact, if I press and hold it, so that bar goes out to the right again. Let me do it in a more exaggerated form. Then you'll see the autopilot is actually putting us into a bank to try and achieve that. So essentially, when it's in manual mode, you can change the attitude quite precisely by pushing on those buttons. And that works with pitch as well. So if you watch the horizontal flight director bar here, I'm going to press the pitch up button and hold it. There we go, we're pitched up to about 10 degrees there. And so that's going to be held in that attitude by the autopilot. Then if I want to pitch down again, they're approximately taking off most of that pitch. So that's manual mode of the autopilot. Now it's fairly convenient making small changes to the attitude when we're in manual mode using the pitch and turn panel. But if we want to make larger changes, we've essentially got to disconnect the autopilot, put the attitude in that we want, and then reselect. In the real aircraft we can do that. If you look on the control yoke, there's a button called CWS, that stands for control wheel steering, and if you hold down that button, that temporarily disconnects the autopilot while you keep the button held down. Then you can adjust the pitch and the roll attitude, and then you can let the button go and it reinstates the autopilot. We don't, strictly speaking, have that function available in the Twin Otter Extended, but we can fake it by using the autopilot engage and disengage. So we could map if we have a button on the joystick, we can map the button down event to disengage autopilot and the button up event to engage autopilot. And that would pretty much do what we want. It's not quite bulletproof because that, strictly speaking, we don't want that button to be operative if the autopilot's not on in the first place. Now we can do that if we're working from a Lua script. We can be more sophisticated in how we program that. So that's autopilot manual mode. Let's find Queenstown and we'll go down. We're going to set it direct to on the GPS. We're going to change the CDI, sorry, we're going to change the nav mode to GPS, and we're going to put nav on the autopilot. So that's going to capture that GPS track and take us in. We could do an ILS approach, or we could go to the VOR. I'm just taking us in on the GPS at the minute. I don't have much experience of ILS approaches, so I'm not really sure what I'm doing with that. Okay, we need to get ready. Got some landing lights on, strobe is on. About 80 knots, airspeed hold is good for now. There's something funny about my installation of Queenstown. This runway, there's something going wrong here with the mesh. Ah, yeah, okay. I think we're in space or hyperspace or something.